Now,
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance of Independent Authors Advanced Self-Publishing Salon for September 2019. And I'm Joanna Penn, as ever. I'm here with Orna Ross. Hi, Orna.
hi, Joanna, and hello, everyone. Are we all in back to
Yes.
school mode here in the Northern Hemisphere?
Indeed. Now, today's show, we're going to be talking about how to use podcasting to market and sell your books. I've recently come back from Podcast Movement in Orlando. Really interesting. So, we'll be talking about a lot of things that will be useful to you. You don't have to start a podcast. We have lots of tips for you coming up. But before we get into the news and any updates, we have an exciting new sponsor, don't we, Orna? Tell us about that.
Yes, indeed. We are very grateful to Ingram Spark, our new specialist sponsor of this advanced self-publishing salon. So we'd like to welcome Ingram as our sponsor and thank them very much for their support of the show. A lot of you know, listening will know that Ingram is an award-winning indie publishing platform and is particularly good for your print-on-demand books, but it gives you a way to share your book with over 39,000 bookstores and libraries worldwide. So if you haven't looked at Ingram Spark, maybe now's the time to have a look.
Yes, absolutely. And we both use Ingram Spark for our books. And I do hardbacks now as well as large print and paperbacks, which is super exciting. So, yeah, love Ingram Spark. So, let's get into the news and the updates. So, Orna, any updates from the Alliance we should know about?
Well, it's always a busy time of year for us, September. Our self-publishing conference comes round every September or October. This year it's in September, mid-September. We're doing it in association with Digital Book World again this year, as we did last year. So we're in preparation for that at the moment. And we have a huge amount of conference content now, and we are sifting through old sessions and saving the evergreen and really valuable stuff. And we're going to put that together into an all access pass, which AskALLi members will have free of charge. We're also setting up on Goodreads genre groups for our members, a way of, it's a bit of an experiment, but we want to see if there's a way in which we can help our members to cross promote more and get to know each other better, and the authors who are in their genre groups, and see what way we could use Goodreads to facilitate that. And the other big news is all around poetry. We have started our self-publishing poetry podcast with the wonderful Dana from Publish Drive is the co-host for that. And as part of that, we're going to actually have some indie poetry. And so that falls into our topic of today very nicely, because we're asking indie poets to submit their poetry in audio. Oh yeah, and one more thing is we are also doing a Rights Roundtable project where we're bringing a few chosen authors through the advice they need to perhaps try and sell their rights at London Book Fair next spring. So we're working with a group of people on that. Michael Anderley from 20 Books to 50K, literary agent Ethan Ellenberg, and a number of authors. And yeah, we just want to see what really happens when people try to sell their rights as an indie, all the different ways we can approach that.
Fantastic.
That is AskALLi. How are you?
Yeah, so I had an unexpected book arrive this month, which was I hadn't like sometimes you set your plans and then something happens, and someone said, did I want to be in a NaNoWriMo bundle? Did I have a new book to go in it? And I was like, I don't, but here's one I could do. So I've written a very short productivity book based on a mini course that I have. So I edited that from a transcript, which is always an interesting experience because there's a lot of rewriting when you go from like stuff like this to actually sentences that might make sense. And also I'm finding, interestingly, I am writing with an ear for audio book as well, which is quite different. So this is going to be a product that started as an audio and will finish in an audio via the medium of the written word, which is really interesting. Maybe the first time I've done it completely from a transcript. I've also finished the public speaking for authors, creatives, and other introverts. Now, what is crazy for us at the moment, and what's for years I wanted pre-orders, right, for ebooks and print books. We have that, but we don't have pre-orders for audio. So you essentially have to, and you just have to wait and see. So I've uploaded the files and I put my pre-order for the other formats for the 1st of October, so a month away, in the hope that ACX and Findaway Voices will have a process where it goes through. Now, it should only take 3 weeks to go through those processes, but at the moment, indies don't have a way to have an exact release date for audio. So I hope that that is something we get in the future. And then, of course, I've been at Podcast Movement, and we'll talk about the details of some of the things I learned, but just from a going to conferences perspective, it had all the pain and suffering of going to a conference, but it was very good to get out of just the author space. Sometimes, just a reminder to everyone, you know, there are people who create in different mediums, and there were people there, you know, who like have a podcast in the aviation industry or beauty niche and lots of fiction, obviously, but just very, very different sets of podcasts. And there were no books in sight. No one was talking about books. So it was quite different. And it was refreshing to get out of the niche and realize what other people were doing in other forms of creativity. So just to encourage everyone that get out of the echo chamber occasionally.
Absolutely. I really think we've got more in common with other creative entrepreneurs who want to get into producing books, audiobooks, podcasts, perhaps, than we have with our trade published colleagues.
Yeah, definitely. And what about you in a personal level?
Oh yeah, my writing. Well, it's been audiobooks for me, and I can't say it's all gone swimmingly, but I've had to do and redo. But I now have 7 chapbooks, 3 select poetry, and a poetry for Christmas audiobook ready to go. So that's great. I took a lot of doing and redoing, and this seems to be a theme for me with audio. Well, with everything. My process is editing, essentially, and you know, finding the mistakes and fixing them up. So also thinking more about audio for the Indie Poetry Please part of our podcast. I've been looking at how to record audio well, and have a long post on that at ornaross.com/recording audio. And I wasn't going to mention this, but I decided, I probably should, because it is taking up my time now. So even though there's no evidence, and it will be a long time before there is probably, I took a writing retreat to return to fiction. So as listeners know, my year of nonfiction turned into more than 2 years of nonfiction, but January should see me return to fiction, and I can't wait. So I've started making notes and beginning the planning for a new novel, a third part of my Irish trilogy, and went back to the roots for the research for that. And had a fantastic complete escape writing retreat all on my own. So that was lovely.
That is fantastic. Okay, so we are now going to get into the theme, and I'm going to start with this, and then Orna, you can come in a minute. But basically, we're going to tackle 2 main questions. Firstly, why is podcasting increasingly important? And secondly, we're going to talk about how can you take action with some of these things, because I realise that often on the advanced show we might talk about stuff that, you know, essentially can take a long time to implement, and, you know, have taken both of us many years, you know, sometimes to actually do that. So we want to give you some things you can get started on right now, as well as things to build for the future. So first of all, let's just talk from my perspective. I did want to ask Orna first before I come in. I want to, because I've been podcasting for over a decade, but you, Orna Ross, who has often said I am not very technical, you have embraced podcasting with gusto, and now podcast every week with different hosts. I know how much work this is. So why do you think you've embraced podcasting so much? And any thoughts for people who feel I'm just not technical enough?
Yeah, well, the reason we took up podcasting, and it was as an experiment, the AskALLi podcast. It was essentially a way of first of all providing a Q&A answer for our members, and then it kind of grew from that. And it's the perfect medium for giving advice in small buckets, which is what is most useful for people. So that's kind of where it started. But as time went on, it developed as these things do, and it took a long time to get it into the right shape, I think. And it's only now really we have worked with different presenters and had different themes and so on, but now we've settled into podcasting about publishing fiction, non-fiction, poetry, and then we have this our member Q&A and this advanced salon, and that just seems to really work well for our members. And so really happy about that. As you so rightly say, technology is not my strong point, and I want to bring that up, not just to have a moan, but to reassure other people who may feel that way about it, because there are a lot of younger people who seem to find this stuff really easy. I have never found it easy and made so many mistakes at the beginning. And people are really forgiving, I think, if they see that you're doing your best and that you are trying to serve them and their needs, they will stay with you through the technical hitches and the flow. I'm not saying, do it on purpose, but I'm saying if you do it, it can feel painful sometimes to make mistakes so publicly. But it's important to kind of get over yourself. And I think that's one of the great things about podcasting is it does strengthen that resilience muscle that indie authors need to have.
But why, I guess I'm trying to put my finger on, why did you decide to embrace podcasting instead of blogging, or because you are written word first? What is it that changed your behavior around marketing? Because you blogged on ornaross.com a long time.
I still do. I mean, it isn't instead of, and I am definitely a written word person primarily, but the immediacy of audio, I think, is what's most valuable about it. And also when people see your face and hear your voice, they get a different sense of you to the sense they get in the written word. So that may be a disappointment for some people. There are lots of people who don't enjoy watching a video of two talking heads talking to each other, but inexplicably there are people who do. And there are other people who like to get it as audio. So it was really about giving people, in the same way as with a book, giving the consumer of the content in the way that they wanted to consume it. You couldn't ignore the fact that so many people were listening to podcasts and so many people are listening to audiobooks. It would be foolish to do so. So I guess that's why, really. So I struggled on, and now I actually love it. It's a highlight of my week doing these podcasts. I really enjoy our chats and all the others as well. So it took time to get here, though. I was deeply uncomfortable at first.
Which is great because you bring up all of the things. So let's get back into those things in a different layer. So to me, one of the last things you said there is to meet an audience where they are. And this is why podcasting is now becoming increasingly important. At Podcast Movement, they said 50% of the US has now listened to a podcast. So it has, this year, 2019, it has reached a tipping point where the word podcast even 18 months ago wasn't really there. The other thing they said is talking about show, that you can listen to my show. It doesn't even have to be the word podcast anymore. And what's happening is people are consuming audio, say on music, Spotify or, other music, even YouTube, and then they're listening to audio, spoken word audio, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, whatever, audiobooks on the same platforms. So that's also very interesting. So you're right, behavior has changed, and that's why it's so important. So just for my own self, I listen to podcasts, a lot, like all the time. Like me and my husband, we listen to them around the house, listen to them when cooking, doing chores. We walk, we don't have a car, so we walk a lot. If we're on our own, we'll listen to a podcast. And so I don't read blogs anymore, and probably haven't for 18 months. And I listen to podcasts. That's where I get most of my book recommendations. And then I listen to audiobooks. And I was reflecting on this, feeling like at the moment for me, I will not find you if you are not available in audio. So if I will not know even your written voice unless I hear you on something. So either an interview with an author, or if I hear about a book, it has to exist in audio for me to consider it, which is a real change in my behavior from where it was. And I know increasingly people who feel this way. The commuter market is huge. The older market, where phones are too small, they want to use voice. We talked about this in the AI thing, but the consumption as well as the speaking. And also younger people who want less screen time. Listening is increasingly a way that people are consuming content, whether that's podcasting, audiobooks, whatever. So has your reading behavior changed at all in that way?
I don't think I am as, not to the degree that yours has. I certainly couldn't say that it's podcasting or audio is my only discovery or even my major. I'm still a written word person, but like everybody else, I'm listening more to podcasts. And I think that's what's so interesting about the space, the way it is dividing up. And particularly if you write in a niche area, podcasting in that area, and we'll be talking about discoverability in a minute, podcasting in that niche is a very quick way to be found within it. I think it's easier to stand out than it is just with the written word. So for discoverability, I definitely think I'm finding people that I wouldn't if I didn't listen to podcasts, is kind of how I would describe it for myself.
Yeah, and even more so, if I'm interested in a topic, I will search my podcast app for that topic. So it's not just that I am just looking, like I would search Google for a question. I'll search Apple Podcast, which is the one I use, for what I want to listen to. So that's really different. And again, yeah, I might often be, I think I'm quite millennial in my behavior, even though I'm Gen X, but, this type of behavior filters through, the population as more people use it. So let's talk about discoverability, because this is the biggest shift that there's been in SEO or search engine optimization in whatever 20 years or whatever it's been, is that Google has just announced that they are indexing podcast episodes. So essentially, behind the scenes in their big Google computers, they will pick up this MP3. Even if we post a transcription, they're still transcribing MP3 in the background, and then they're using their transcription as a way to help people find episodes. And this is being rolled out across the world. So for Americans searching in English right now, and I think you have to use the word podcast right now, but what they're going to do is change search so that you won't have to say the word podcast, but they will still return audio in the search results. So this is massive. And it really means that if you want to be found, like for me, 90% of my business is based on organic traffic. I do some paid ads, but it's tiny compared to my organic traffic based on content marketing. So for people like me, I'm sure many people listening do have that type of thing where they're found through word of mouth and content marketing and stuff. This is a huge shift. What it does mean is you can be very strategic with it. So like you've said, if you want to start a podcast now, it's a great time to think about the right headlines for your podcast, using good search SEO terms, being very specific about your topics, not just rambling off on tons and tons of different things, but being very focused, so that when people are searching for something, you come up. So very interesting time in SEO. So this is a big deal, right?
It's a huge, big deal. And there are two aspects to it. There is the discoverability thing, whereby, it's a natural sort of progression. Audio marketing, podcasting will sell your audiobooks, but may also sell your print and your ebook. I think it's, a listener who is already in audio mode. It has been very difficult up to now to market audiobooks. And I think this and a couple of other developments like BookBub's Chirp and stuff means that audio is going to grow it's growing really rapidly, but it's going to grow even more. And this is just fantastic, I think, for those of us who rely on our work to attract our followers. And content marketing, as you say, attractor marketing. So it's really good news, and it's a really good time to be coming in. And I think the thing about coming in is to get very, very, as you say, strategic, but very specific about what it is you offer as an author, what you want your books to be doing, and to get a podcast that is reflective of that, and to use those search terms in a clever way. And I think it's a great time for authors, because I think, you know, a lot of us have kind of learned this as we've gone along, made mistakes doing it, couldn't understand it, but now are much clearer through blogging and other forms of content marketing. So now can kind of get ahead, in a sense, I think, in this new world, because there are a lot of people podcasting, but there are not a lot of creatives doing podcasting in a creative way. And story is key to audio. It's really back to that primal, very first sort of connection of listening to the story. And as writers, I think we can develop that in much more interesting ways than the average podcaster is doing.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And also, another really important thing that they talked about was the idea that the world is tired of fake news, and the world is tired of ads. We've talked about this before, this kind of ad overwhelm, fake news, even things like where Instagram influencers, have now become almost fake as well in so many ways, where advertising radio networks, TV shows, everyone's doing their thing. And what they very much emphasize, and it was demonstrated by the amount of money coming into podcasting, is they're seeing podcasters as the next level of influencer, which is when people listen to our voice, you give away so much in your voice, right? So some people can see our face, but even if you're listening to our voice, you can hear me smile. You can hear if we are angry at each other. You can hear the undercurrent, this is why we podcast so well together, because we've been friends a long time and we know each other. But people can tell that from the way we talk and our relationship, and you can't hide. People can hear minutiae in your voice. So this is why audio is becoming more important as well. And that connection with the person coming back to driving book sales, if someone does care about you in some way and feels a connection, then they are far more likely to check out your work. So when Orna talks about, her Irish books, the fact that when you speak, you have an Irish accent immediately makes it more real to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to stress also that fiction writers often count themselves out of audio. And I think it's really important to say that the fiction space is going to take off. There are already people doing interesting things in the fiction space. And I just, my 92-year-old cousin is now podcasting his novel, and he has no technical ability whatsoever. He's working with a service to do it, but it's his voice. And again, it's very, personal kind of autobiographical tale, and it's working really well as a podcast. And he's already garnering some followers, and he's not bringing the book out until he's finished the podcast, which I think is 25 episodes or something like that. And they're already signing up for the pre-order and dying for the book to be out. So, if he can do it, I think it's very straightforward. There's nothing particularly creative about it. It's just him reading, really. He is a good performer, though. He does perform.
He's performing. He's not reading.
He's not reading. He's performing his words. Yeah, he's a raconteur. He's able to kind of spin a yarn, as we say in Ireland, and he does it really well. So, but it's an example. I just wanted to say he has no technical ability. He has an email service, so he's able to use an audio service. It's audiobooks for the arts, and they are kind of making his podcast for him, and it looks like it's going to sell his book in audio and in print and ebook too.
Well, I think this is really important because podcasting is also incredibly creative, and it is it's not new, it's as old as the hills. Telling a story with your voice is as old as the hills. But what I found at Podcast Movement is an incredibly active fiction, audio first fiction group, wonderful voice talent, writers, directors coming together to create multi-voice fiction productions and essentially writing audio fiction for the podcast way of doing things. And this is important, I think. I understand why your friend is doing that, but true podcast fiction, it seems, is an episodic, serialized story, a bit like a TV show. So this is the difference between film, which is audiobooks, and Ivo Terra, who started Podiobooks, I met him there, and he said an audiobook is like a film, and a podcast is like TV. So that, I think that's how you need to think about it, because the podcast is a serialized format, whereas an audiobook is end-to-end journey. So, and remember, when you're writing a series, you have the story arc, in these serialized ways, whereas the story arc for one film or one audiobook has kind of one overarching thing. So you have to, if you want to do an effective audio fiction project, you're almost thinking more like a TV series. And this is exciting. Writing for audio drama, if you have a look at what is being produced now in audio for podcasts, not just for audiobooks, it's very interesting. Audible is doing a lot of free podcasts as part of their audiobook thing now. They really are trying to capture people onto that platform. But that, I think, is super exciting. And I feel the need to create more in audio format, which is fascinating. And of course, everything starts with the written word, but then the finished product or the first product might be audio, and followed by, you might then adapt your audio drama to a book format, which is completely different writing. So really interesting, creative time we're coming into.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting what you're saying, and thinking about my cousin's book. Actually, it's picaresque. It is episodic. It's one kind of almost complete short story after another, which kind of builds to the end. So perhaps that's why it is doing well. We have some questions here about what kinds of ideas people might take up for podcasting fiction. So did you come across any interesting sort of examples while you were
it's so varied. What I would suggest is that people just go and spend some time and download some podcast episodes, all free after all, and see what people are doing. There's things like, one woman shows that, like as if it was and again, also look at things like Netflix and Amazon Prime. It's almost exactly the same type of thing, but in audio. There's some very interesting I'm listening to a podcast at the moment called Land of the Giants, which, yes, is non-fiction, but it's investigative journalism, where his thesis is kind of his article, but then he's interspersing it with quotes from interviews that he's done. So it's more, and there's obviously some of the famous ones. True crime is huge, but with fiction, you can obviously do audio plays, radio play style with multiple characters. You can do so many things, but the best thing to do with any of this is like when someone says, "Oh, what genre is my book in?" Well, then you say, go and read, find 10 books that are like yours and see what category they're in. You have to do this. Just go and listen, download a load of podcast episodes and see what you like. And then think, how can I create something that is like that? So that would be my tip there. But should we move into how you can take action? Because that's probably the next bit. So let's first start with the feeling, the issue that many authors have with their voice. And Orna, I think you have a beautiful voice and you have this lovely accent, but you've said many times to me that you struggle with your voice. So, and I have over the years too. So how do you tackle that need to get over yourself?
Yeah, I cover this in that post, because I think these are the behind the scenes things that we don't talk enough about, maybe. For me, it's about doing it over and over and over again, so much that it kind of becomes almost part of you. So I've been recording mostly poetry, so learning it off by heart by repeating it so often and doing it in funny voices and all the rest of it, so that when I come to actually stand there and record it, it's almost part of me, and I've forgotten about the voice kind of thing. I will never like the sound of my own voice, but I don't think that matters. Some people don't like the sound of my voice, and some people do. And that's the way it is with your books. That's the way it is with everything. And it doesn't matter. Some people always will like what you do. Some people always won't like what you do. The main thing is just to get on and do it, I think. So it really is just about saying, I got to get over myself and get over that. Yeah. What about you?
I think what's lovely is we, in fiction or in non-fiction, even with our written word, we use the word voice. Like, this is written, is where's your original voice? But it's a metaphor. Whereas now it's actually true. It's your voice. If people don't like our voice, they're not listening. And this is another, if I start download a podcast and I can't stand the voice, I don't listen. Or, the same with audiobooks. So that's basically the first thing is you have to get used to it. And the best way to get used to it is to speak out loud a lot. As Orna said, you have to practice and practice, or like have an author friend and do this type of thing, like interview each other about your books and just get used to having a conversation, because and this would be the thing, you do have to upskill. So whatever, if you are going to get into this, you have to upskill, you have to practice, you have to give it a go, because you won't get better otherwise. So number 2 is really to be a guest on other podcasts. Now, this is actionable by anyone in any genre. Whatever you write, there will be a podcast out there. And if there isn't, then maybe you should start one, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But essentially pitching podcasts that are in your niche. Now, this doesn't have to be a fiction podcast if you're a fiction writer. So for example, I was interviewed on a Jungian psychology podcast about how I used Carl Jung's Red Book in my novel Stone of Fire. So we talked about Carl Jung and the psychology behind fiction and stuff like that. So that was that was an interesting side angle for my fiction. And that's why I've started Books and Travel podcast, because it's a side angle into my fiction. So that's just one example. So pitching, I would suggest you pitch the smallest possible podcasts first. Newbie podcasts, your friends, anyone where you are not at risk of damaging anything. And then at least if you get things technically wrong or you hate it, that's just a practice run. So that would be a top tip. And wait until you have done like 10 episodes of something before, you're as a guest, before you pitch a higher level podcast with more traffic, because that is going to be a harder pitch and you need some evidence that you can be a good guest. I've had guests on my show that have just been appalling guests, and now I'm very careful to research how people are going to be on the show. So any tips there, Orna, for appearing on other people's podcasts?
Yeah, I think you've covered that one well. I think it's also possible to practice with a small closed group, so that, a trusted group of people. So, and not everything you do needs to be designed to go out to the big wide world. So, for example, I do an audio meditation with a small group of people each morning, with no attempt to take that beyond the shores, but doing it has definitely helped me to, in my audio work. And I think the more you do in different kinds of ways, the more comfortable you become with it. And comfortable enough is all we need, just that we're kind of taking our risk from a place where we still feel safe, not, giving ourselves such a fright that we do it once and we never do it again. So whatever works for you, you might even want, if you're really shy, you might even want to do some private sessions with a friend where you practice together before you put it out there at all. But there is a lot to be said also for leaping in. So, that's what I did with podcasting over 2 years ago. And a lot of people kind of stayed with it through the ups and the downs and the ins and the outs. And, when people see you being vulnerable, it doesn't necessarily put them off you. It can be, depending on the kind of person they are, it can actually deepen the connection. So, I think it always comes back to that thing. I know I'm repeating myself, of just kind of do it and drop it, and then do the next thing and drop that, and just keep on keeping on. And that's really good practice for us as authors when it comes to writing our work as well.
But I think if you're pitching, I agree with all those things. If you're starting your own show, you can let it all hang out. But if you're pitching a podcaster to appear on their show, it's their show, and you are in their house. Basically.
Absolutely. I didn't mean under those conditions. Sorry, I was moving on to.
You were moving on. Yeah, I'm still on getting on other people's shows. I mean, I get pitched like 5 times a day to appear on the Creative Penn podcast, and it has to be something that I think my audience will find useful, that I will be interested in talking to that person. And it's incredible still how many times a day I get an email that says, I've written a book. Can I come on your podcast? Like that, I've written a book. Here's the title. Can I come on your podcast? With no knowledge of who the audience are, what will help me. And the best pitches are, I've been listening to your show for X. I loved this episode. I've written a book on this topic that I think would be useful to your audience in this way. These are the 5 talking points. If you'd like a copy of the book, here's a downloadable, a book funnel link or whatever. And I'm flexible on timing. That's a good pitch, and if it fits, I'm all in. So that's just some tips there. But getting on, sorry,
just before you leave that one, and just to say that goes on forever. So if you want people to turn up to your podcast in time, you are going to have to go out and be on other podcasts. So pitching well, understanding your value, understanding which podcasts are aligned to you and your audiobooks. If you can get it all lined up as closely as possible, so that your podcast picks up on something that is very close to your audiobooks, and get your books into audio if you can. I understand that it is a financial commitment, but the return on audio when it's done well is, and you might say that it's probably not worth podcasting unless you have an audiobook. Would you agree with that?
No.
Okay. What do you think?
But just before we move off the getting on other people's podcasts, the blog tour that has been a staple of book marketing for so long is now the podcast tour. So I would expect all these different companies to be popping up, getting you on podcasts, and that's already happening. But that will happen. So having a podcast without a book, or a book at all, or an audiobook. So I started my podcast before I had anything, and I built an audience. So when my first novel came out 2.5 years later, I had people who were ready to buy. So it was definitely, it's a way to build an audience. It's a way to attract an audience, like your cousin or whatever it was doing that book. You can podcast before the book is out, and what's wonderful is it's evergreen. So if you're on topic and then you produce a book later, you're going to sell more of that book. So I would suggest that it's actually quite a good way to, like many people would say, start a blog. Like in the olden days, it was start a blog before your book is out to build an audience or an email list. Now it's start a podcast before. So think about it that way. Podcasting is kind of the new blogging, and that will help. But just on starting your own podcast, because this is a leap. So the first thing was much easier, but if you have control, and we are indies, so we like control. If you have control, you get to learn things. So, but you and I both enjoy learning things, and we always learn from each other and other guests. I love learning from my guests. I learn something every show. And also, you get to talk about your books. You get to do a more personal segment about what you're writing. So you always get to market. You also get to build credibility. And also you get to talk to people you might not otherwise. So I don't do any written guest posts. People ask me and I say, sorry, I don't do written guest posts. I don't do consulting. But I do a lot of podcast interviews because it's easy. It's a good use of my time. It's good marketing and it's much quicker than the written word. So what about you, Orna? What are some of the benefits of having your own podcast?
I think, we've covered a lot of the benefits. I'd like to pick up, if you don't mind, because we are running out of time. We've a few people here in the comments who are a little bit unsure, and a question: doesn't developing a podcast take away from real fiction writing? That's from Regina, who is also, concerned about the cost of an audiobook and sorry that blogs are no longer have the weight that they had. Do you think that podcasting needs to take away from, in inverted commas, real fiction writing? Can it become part of the process?
Yeah. I mean, I think unless you understand, I think there are two different times of day. One is creative time and the other time is marketing time. And I've written 30 books in the last 10 years, and that's been done in my creative time. My podcasting is done in my marketing time, and podcasting has been my primary marketing mechanism for 10 years. So everyone has to do marketing, people. We know this. So what do you choose to do? I personally do not like doing ads, paid ads. I love podcasting. What's happened is it's turned into something I never knew it could be, which is the most, I say the most right now. Podcasting is so satisfying to me. It's part of my creative body of work. It's intellectual property asset. It's relationships. It's reaching people. It's helping people. So when you say real fiction writing, in a way, I feel almost offended, because this is my creativity, and you can write for audio as much as you can write for the written word. So let's not think that this is just marketing either. This is a form of creativity, but you can keep it completely separate and use it just for your marketing. But I want you guys to get the excitement of using a different medium to create. Yeah, that's how I feel. How do you feel?
I found reading my own fiction aloud when I thought I might narrate my own fiction. I found that incredibly useful as an editing tool. And if I had the performance skills, or if I upskill maybe performance-wise, I don't know if I ever will, I think a fantastic process would be to do your your good first draft, and then try to narrate your own audiobook. And in the doing of that, you will see your errors screaming back at you in a way that you definitely don't when you're just sitting at the computer. So I think some people can build it into their process, particularly if they're going to narrate their own books. I took my poetry book and my audio, recording into my creative time, because I did feel that it was a sort of a creation of itself. It was different to the actual text. And somebody also in the comments said, that poetry is meant to be read aloud, but fiction isn't. And I'm not so sure that that's true. I think stories have been told out loud by the voice since humanity sat around a fire. And a lot of page poets are resisting hugely the audio movement in poetry. So I think it's worth looking at this and saying, of course, it's not for everybody. Nothing we talk about is for everybody. It may not be for you. We're not saying that it is. But what we are saying is, take a look at this. There's a lot happening here. And when there is this kind of excitement and growth, it's a good time to step in. So stepping in now, you will be a bit ahead of the curve, and if you like it, if it can become part of your process, if you can come up with a creative podcast, if you can use podcasting in some way to supplement what you're doing already, and or if you want to use it as a marketing tool because you're sick of typing words and you'd actually find it easier to speak them, then it could make a lot of sense for you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good note to end on. And I credit my podcast, and now I have 2 podcasts, with really the basis of my author business and my book sales. And I have the confidence, if I lose everything on Amazon because they're changing the blooming algorithms again, then I can still sell books because I have a direct route to a market, a global market. So my podcast has been downloaded in 218 countries, which is almost every country in the world. Far more people have listened to my show than have read my books. So this is a renaissance, as we've said many times. This is part of the maker movement. This is part of independent creation. I don't see it as that different. And this audio fiction group at the podcast movement, they were awesome. I was kind of like, oh, I wish I was with them, because they were so creative and so just making stuff in an audio way. So let's free our minds and see what we can do with audio. So we're not going to talk about making audiobooks tonight, because we don't have time left. We've talked about audiobooks before, and will again, I'm sure, but tonight was all about how podcasting can help you sell and market your book. So I hope you've found that useful. So Orna, any comments or things you want people to be looking at for the next month?
Yeah, well, we're going to be focusing on rights at AskALLi over the next 6 months. And this has a relevance for audio as well, because traditionally audio books were a subsidiary right, and now indies have the ability to create their own. And so, yeah, I think thinking in terms of what is your body of work, and where might audio fit into what you consider to be the impact that you are trying to have in the world. That's the kind of approach that we would encourage. So yeah, the only thing I want to say to people, 2 things, is that we have our self-publishing conference coming up on the 14th and 15th of September. So if you haven't registered for that already, if you've registered before, you're registered for this one. If you haven't registered for that, it's at selfpublishingadviceconference.com. Yeah, it's a long one. And the other thing is just to remind you that the Advanced Self-Publishing Salon was brought to you today by our special sponsor, ingramspark.com. And next time we'll be talking about licensing. We're off to the licensing show, and this is where the rights come in. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Happy writing, happy publishing. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.